Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover inspiring tales of transformation, resilience, and the incredible power of human connection. Today's story follows the journey of Linda and Robert, two people whose lives collide in a moment of conflict, but evolve into an extraordinary bond that changes them both forever. It was a crisp spring morning in Maplewood, a quiet suburban town surrounded by lush greenery and peaceful parks. Maplewood Park, in particular, was a sanctuary for many, a place where families gathered, joggers found their rhythm, and locals sought solace in nature. Among the visitors that morning was Linda Harrison, a 45-year-old woman who walked the gravel paths with purpose. Her tailored athletic wear and pristine sneakers spoke of someone accustomed to order and control, someone who believed the world should conform to her expectations. Linda's life was, by all accounts, one of privilege. She had a comfortable home, a secure job, and a social circle that mirrored her sense of entitlement. Yet, beneath the polished exterior was a restlessness she couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was fear of losing what she had, or perhaps it was the echoes of her own past struggles she rarely acknowledged, but that had shaped her view of the world. This morning, however, she wasn't reflecting on herself. Instead, her attention was drawn to a man lying on a bench by the duck pond. The man was Robert Carter, a 58-year-old homeless veteran. His weathered face, partially obscured by a worn baseball cap, showed the strain of years spent surviving on the margins. His clothes were tattered, his belongings contained in a small, battered backpack at his feet. For Robert, Maplewood Park was a temporary refuge, a place where he could rest before facing another day of uncertainty. As Linda approached the bench, her sharp eyes narrowed. To her, Robert was an intruder, a blemish on the pristine image of the park she cherished. She tightened her grip on her designer water bottle, her mind racing with judgments that came quicker than she could question them. This was her park, her sanctuary, and she would not allow it to be disrupted. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the morning air. "You can't sleep here. This is a respectable neighborhood park, not a shelter." Robert stirred, his movements slow and deliberate as he sat up and rubbed his eyes. His voice was hoarse when he spoke, carrying the weariness of someone who had long learned to avoid conflict. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll move along." But his quiet compliance did little to appease Linda. In fact, it seemed to fuel her indignation. "You'd better move along," she snapped, her tone laced with disdain. "People like you don't belong here. You're making this place unsafe for decent folks." Robert's shoulders slumped under the weight of her words. But he said nothing. He had heard it all before, words that stung but no longer surprised him. As he reached for his backpack, Linda pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, dialing the familiar numbers of the police. "Yes. Hello," she said, her voice trembling with feigned concern. "There's a suspicious person in Maplewood Park. A homeless man. He's being aggressive, and I don't feel safe. Please send someone quickly." Her words, spoken with conviction, painted a picture far removed from the reality of the situation. Around her, other park-goers began to take notice. An elderly man feeding the ducks shook his head in quiet disapproval. A young mother jogging with her baby slowed her pace, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Yet no one intervened. For Robert, the sound of Linda's voice was both familiar and disheartening. He had served his country for over 2 decades, first as a proud Marine and later as a man grappling with the aftermath of war. PTSD and a series of misfortunes had left him homeless, navigating a system that seemed designed to overlook him. Now, as he sat on the bench, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the police, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen. When the sound of sirens broke the tranquility of the park, Linda straightened her posture. Her smug satisfaction was evident as she adjusted her jacket, ready to play the role of the concerned citizen. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the park entrance, and officers Daniel Ruiz and Sarah Thompson stepped out. Officer Ruiz, a seasoned policeman with 15 years on the force, approached Linda first. "Good morning, "Ma'am," he said, his tone professional but measured. "We received your call. Can you tell us what happened?" Linda wasted no time launching into her story. Her voice trembled as she described the aggressive man on the bench, her words carefully chosen to paint herself as the victim. As she spoke, Officer Ruiz's gaze shifted to Robert, who sat quietly with his hands visible on his lap. Something about Robert's demeanor, a quiet dignity despite his circumstances, gave Ruiz pause. "Sir," Ruiz said, turning to Robert. "Can I ask your name?" "Robert Carter," he replied, his voice steady. "I apologize for any disturbance. I'll be on my way." Ruiz's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone softening. "Did you serve?" Robert hesitated before answering, his shoulders straightening slightly. "Yes, sir. 23 years. Marines." Ruiz nodded, the connection immediate. "Thank you for your service." "Mr. Carter, I served as well. Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." Before the two men could continue their exchange, Linda interjected, her impatience evident. "Excuse me, but what does that have to do with anything? This man is trespassing and making the park unsafe. I demand that you remove him immediately." Officer Ruiz's expression hardened as he turned back to Linda. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "Mr. Carter hasn't committed any crime. Being homeless is not illegal, and he has as much right to be in this public park as anyone else." Linda's face flushed with anger. She pulled out her phone, this time to record the officers. "I can't believe this," she exclaimed. "I'm going to report this to your superiors. You're refusing to protect tax-paying citizens from vagrancy." Officer Thompson, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," she said calmly. "You're escalating the situation unnecessarily." Meanwhile, Ruiz crouched slightly to meet Robert's gaze. "Have you been in contact with the VA?" he asked. "There are programs available for veterans in need of housing assistance." Robert sighed, his weariness evident. "I've tried, sir. The waiting lists are long, and the paperwork, it's overwhelming, especially with my PTSD." Ruiz reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "I understand," he said. "Look, I know someone at the local Veterans Center, Dave Martinez. He's good at cutting through the red tape. Give him a call and tell him Daniel Ruiz sent you." Linda, now red with frustration, continued her tirade, oblivious to the growing disapproval of the park's other visitors. Many had begun recording the interaction, their phones capturing her venomous words and the calm professionalism of the officers. Finally, Ruiz turned to Linda, his patience waning. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, "you called us here under false pretenses, claiming Mr. Carter was aggressive when he clearly was not. Making false reports to the police is a serious offense." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "This can't be happening," she muttered, before storming off, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. As the police cruisers departed and the park began to quiet once more, Robert sat on the bench, staring at the card in his hand. The encounter had been yet another reminder of the prejudice he faced daily. But Ruiz's gesture of kindness was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Little did Linda or Robert know, this moment in the park was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge their perceptions, reshape their lives, and bring about lessons they never expected to learn. The days following the incident in Maplewood Park were a whirlwind for Linda Harrison. The encounter, which she had initially viewed as a righteous act of protecting her community, quickly spiraled into a public relations nightmare. Bystander videos from the park began to circulate on social media, revealing the full scope of her behavior. The clips showed Linda berating Robert Carter, her tone condescending and her words laced with prejudice, while the officers calmly diffused the situation. What Linda had intended as a display of civic responsibility was instead viewed as an act of intolerance. The backlash was swift. Her social media pages were flooded with comments ranging from disappointment to outright condemnation. Even her friends and colleagues began to distance themselves, their silence speaking louder than words. At work, whispers followed her down the hallways. and her boss summoned her to his office within days. "Linda," he began, his tone sharp but restrained. "Your actions in the park have brought negative attention to this company. We pride ourselves on being inclusive, and this doesn't align with our values. I'm afraid we have to let you go." The words hit her like a blow as she packed up her belongings, carrying her life out of the office in a single cardboard box. Linda felt a crushing sense of shame. Her world, once so controlled and predictable, had unraveled in the span of days. Across town, Robert Carter's life was taking a different turn. Officer Daniel Ruiz's business card was more than a piece of paper. It was a lifeline. For years, Robert had struggled to navigate the labyrinthine system of veteran support services, his PTSD making the process feel insurmountable. But Ruiz's introduction to Dave Martinez at the local veteran center changed everything. Dave was a man of action, someone who understood the unique struggles of veterans. Within hours of meeting Robert, he was already cutting through bureaucratic red tape, helping him apply for housing assistance, connect with a PTSD support group, and enroll in a job training program. For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of hope. His days were no longer consumed by the constant search for food and shelter. Instead, they were filled with a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Linda's days were marked by isolation and self-reflection. With her career in shambles and her social circle dwindling, she was forced to confront the person she had become. The shame that had initially burned hot began to simmer into something more productive, a desire to change, to do better. It was during one of her long, solitary walks that she passed by the community soup kitchen and saw a sign in the window, "Volunteers needed." The idea of volunteering hadn't crossed her mind before. Charity, to Linda, had always been something transactional, donations made from a distance, far removed from the people they were meant to help. But now, standing outside the soup kitchen, she felt a pull she couldn't quite explain. The next morning, she signed up for a shift. At first, the work was overwhelming. The kitchen was hot and noisy, the tasks monotonous and physically demanding. But there was something grounding about the experience. Each meal she served, each dish she washed, felt like a small act of penance, a step toward rebuilding her fractured sense of self. It was during one of her shifts, a few weeks later, that Linda spotted a familiar face. Robert Carter walked into the kitchen, accompanied by Dave Martinez. Linda froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone here, in a place where she was trying to atone for her actions. Dave noticed her hesitation and approached with a warm smile. "Linda, right?" he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dave Martinez. Robert told me about what happened in the park. I think it's great that you're volunteering here." Linda forced a smile, her mind racing. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted to Robert, who stood quietly behind Dave, his expression unreadable. "Robert's here to explore volunteer opportunities." Dave continued. "He's been making great progress. Thought giving back might be a good next step." Linda nodded, her gaze meeting Robert's for the briefest moment. "That's wonderful," she said. "Welcome." The first few shifts they worked together were tense. Linda kept her distance, unsure of how to approach Robert. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words always seemed to catch in her throat. Robert, for his part, was polite but reserved, his interactions with Linda limited to brief exchanges about work. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up after the lunch rush, Linda finally gathered the courage to speak. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to apologize for how I treated you in the park. I was wrong, and I deeply regret my actions." Robert paused, his hands stilling over the sink. He turned to face her, his expression calm but serious. "Apologies are easy, Mrs. Harrison," he said. "It's actions that matter." His words stung, but Linda nodded. "I understand," she said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know that I'm trying to change." Over time, Linda's sincerity began to break down Robert's walls. He saw her working tirelessly, not just at the soup kitchen, but also in her efforts to educate herself about the struggles faced by people like him, veterans, the homeless, those society so often overlooks. Slowly, their interactions grew less strained, and a tentative understanding began to form between them. One day, as they were setting up for dinner service, Robert spoke first. "You know, when you called the cops on me, I thought that was the end of the road. I've faced a lot of prejudice in my life. But that day, it felt like too much." Linda looked at him, guilt heavy in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I can't change what I did, but I want to do better." Robert studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're doing the work," he said. "That counts for something." As the weeks turned into months, their relationship continued to evolve. Linda began to see Robert not as a symbol of her guilt, but as a person, a man with a rich history, deep pain, and remarkable resilience. Robert, in turn, began to see Linda's determination to change as genuine. What had started as a chance meeting in a park had grown into something neither of them could have anticipated, a cautious but meaningful friendship. Little did they know, their bond would soon be tested in ways that would reveal the true depth of their growth and the strength of their newfound understanding. But for now, in the warmth of the soup kitchen, they found solace in their shared efforts to make the world a little kinder. One meal at a time, as weeks turned into months, the bond between Linda Harrison and Robert Carter began to solidify into something neither had expected, a genuine friendship forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their time together at the soup kitchen evolved from cautious collaboration into a steady partnership, and eventually, something more profound, mutual respect and understanding. But their journey toward healing and redemption was far from over. Robert was making remarkable progress, thanks to the connections provided by Officer Ruiz and Dave Martinez. He was now enrolled in a job training program and living in transitional housing. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was back on track. His days were filled with purpose, and his evenings often brought quiet reflection. However, the scars of his past, both physical and emotional, were still present, lingering reminders of the road he had traveled. Linda, too, had undergone a transformation. Volunteering at the soup kitchen and working alongside Robert had forced her to confront the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped her worldview. She no longer saw herself as the arbiter of what was right in her community. Instead, she saw herself as a student, learning from the people she had once dismissed. One afternoon, after the lunch rush had settled, Linda and Robert sat together in the quiet kitchen. The warm aroma of freshly baked bread lingered in the air as they sipped coffee from mismatched mugs. For the first time, Linda felt comfortable enough to share a piece of her own story. "You know," she began, her voice hesitant, "I wasn't always the person you met in the park that day. There was a time when I struggled too, financially, emotionally. I guess I've spent so much time trying to forget those years that I started looking down on anyone who reminded me of them." Robert nodded, his gaze steady. "It's easy to build walls when you're afraid of what's on the other side," he said. "But walls don't protect us. They just keep us isolated." His words resonated deeply with Linda. "I think that's what I've been doing," she admitted. "Building walls, shutting people out, and convincing myself that I was doing it for the right reasons. But meeting you, working here, it's opened my eyes. And I'm so sorry it took something like that day in the park to wake me up." Robert gave a small smile, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't come easy," he said. "But you're doing the work. Linda, that matters." Their conversation marked a turning point. From that day forward, their friendship deepened, fueled by honest conversations and shared goals. They began meeting outside the soup kitchen, grabbing coffee or taking walks through Maplewood Park, which had become a symbol of their journey. Each visit to the park felt like reclaiming a piece of their story, transforming it from a place of conflict to one of connection. But life is a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One crisp October morning, Linda arrived at the park for her usual walk. She was surprised to see Robert sitting on the bench where their story had begun. His head was bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Something about his posture told her that something was wrong. "Robert," she called out, concern lacing her voice. "Is everything okay?" He looked up, and she was struck by the weariness in his eyes. "Linda," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know what to do." She sat beside him, giving him the space to gather his thoughts. After a long silence, he spoke. "I got a call from my daughter last night. My ex-wife, she's sick. Cancer. It's bad. And she doesn't have much time left. My daughter wants me to come home to California to help, to say goodbye." Linda's heart ached for him. "Oh, Robert," she said softly. "Of course. You should go. You need to be with your family." He shook his head, frustration evident in the gesture. "It's not that simple," he said. "I haven't seen my family in years. Not since I became homeless. I don't even know if I belong there anymore. And then there's the money. I can't afford the trip." Without hesitation, Linda placed a hand on his arm. "You do belong, Robert," she said firmly. "And we'll figure out the rest. You're not alone in this." Over the next few days, Linda threw herself into helping Robert prepare for the trip. She reached out to her network, managing to secure a discounted plane ticket. She helped him navigate the process of taking a leave of absence from his job training program, ensuring that his spot would be waiting for him when he returned. Through it all, she offered him the encouragement he needed to take this difficult step. The morning of Robert's flight, Linda drove him to the airport. As they stood at the security checkpoint, she turned to him with a smile that didn't quite mask the emotion swirling beneath the surface. "You'll do great," she said. "Your family will be so glad to see you." Robert nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and nervousness. "Linda," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "This is what friends do for each other." As Robert disappeared into the crowd, Linda felt a pang of sadness. The thought of not seeing him for several weeks left a void she hadn't expected. But more than anything, she felt pride. Pride in how far he had come, and pride in the small role she had played in his journey. However, their friendship would soon face its greatest test. In the weeks that followed, Linda found herself missing Robert's steady presence. She kept herself busy at the soup kitchen, but couldn't shake the worry that lingered at the back of her mind. Then, one evening, she overheard a conversation between two volunteers that made her blood run cold. "Did you hear about that homeless vet?" one of them said. "Apparently, he scammed a woman into paying for a trip to California. Now he's disappeared." Linda's heart sank. The details were eerily similar to Robert's story. Had she been naive? Had her desire to make amends blinded her to the truth? Over the next few days, she tried repeatedly to contact Robert, but her calls went straight to voicemail. When she reached out to Dave Martinez at the Veterans Center, she learned that Robert hadn't been in touch with them either. Doubt began to creep in, threatening to undo all the progress she had made. Just as she was about to give up, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was from California. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello, Linda," the voice on the other end said, rough and familiar. "It's Robert. I'm so sorry I haven't been in touch. Things have been complicated." Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by a surge of anger and confusion. "Robert, where have you been? Do you have any idea what's been happening here?" There was a pause before he spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'll explain everything," he said, "but I need your help. Can you come to California?" Linda hesitated, torn between her lingering doubts and the bond they had built. Finally, she made her decision. "All right, Robert," she said, "I'll come, but when I get there, you'd better have one hell of an explanation." What neither of them realized was that this next chapter would not only test their friendship, but also solidify the lessons they had learned about trust, forgiveness, and the transformative power of connection. Their journey, far from over, was about to reach its most profound turning point. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of redemption and friendship. Linda and Robert's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, understanding and empathy can lead to profound growth and connection. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.